Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation today. I really appreciate it. I want to tell you that about 2 years ago in Mississauga, we launched our first radio station. And I don't know if you know that, but for a longest time, former Mayor Hazen McCallion really was disappointed that Mississauga didn't have its own media and thought that we were completely overshadowed by what was going on in Toronto. And we applied, Mississauga applied, both private people with the support of the city of Mississauga for a CRTC approval for a radio station. And it was granted about 2 years ago. And then they spent a fair amount of time getting the funds to get launched. And they launched about 2 years ago today. And in September of 2020, they asked me to join as their drive home guy. And it was a real privilege for me to join as the drive home guy. And it's kind of interesting and it's been a lot of fun. And who knew in September of 2020 that 6 months later we'd be hit by COVID-19. And as Jan, I think very kindly described, I'm a reasonably active social person, as probably a lot of you are. And I think I would have gone nuts if it hadn't been for the opportunity for me to interact with as many people as I've interacted with through my radio show and the interviews that I've done. So I want to tell you a little bit about that if I could. Before I start, I want to thank you for inviting me back. I've, I think, come to your Rotary about 3 times in the past, and I've talked about the Mississauga Summit that I was chair of. In the past, I've spoken about the Mississauga Arts Council, which I was the president of, and I've spoken about transit. I'm chair of something called Transit Alliance, and you've been very kind to allow me to have my soapbox to speak with you. And Jan was kind at one point in time to actually try to recruit me to join you. And probably some of you turned down my membership. I don't know why, but I was just too busy to join, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you. I should also say, if I could, that one of my ex-wife's biggest supporters and one of my biggest supporters was Jan's husband. And I guess it was a year ago where I, along with probably all of you, passed on my condolences to Jan. And I just got to tell you, he was one of the most amazing men I've ever had the privilege of meeting and interacting with. He was a wonderful gentleman, and my condolences to you again, since I didn't have a chance in person to do that in the past. I want to tell you a little bit about my show on Saga 960, if I could, and I'm going to share my screen and take you through some slides as a way of sharing with you the incredible opportunity that I've had. Have you all can see my slide? Hopefully. No one's responding, so hopefully you can see it.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
So the Brian Crombie Radio Hour is on every night, 6 o'clock on Saga 960 AM. You can also stream it on live at www.saga960m.ca. It's interesting. I've got video casts on my own website, briancrombie.com. It's on YouTube. It's on Facebook. It's on LinkedIn. Right now, even though I'm the drive home guy at 6 o'clock every night, I'm getting more people viewing it via video on social media. And that's one of the things I want to talk a little bit about today. Also, podcasts on Audible, Apple, Spotify, Speakeasy, almost all the different vehicles where podcasts are available. And if you haven't checked me out at all, I really appreciate it if you'd give me a listen at some point in time. And there's a couple of reasons why. And I want to tell you a little bit about, number one, why I think I'm relevant and the show is relevant. We talk about politics and civic issues. And as some of you may know, I've been involved in politics in all 3 levels of politics in both Ontario as well as British Columbia. My great uncle was Premier of Ontario in 1943. My second cousin was leader of the Liberal Party and Treasurer of Ontario. My second cousin, once removed, was Cabinet Minister of HDRC in the federal government. My sister was the Assistant Deputy Minister of the Environment and of Health. So I've got a lot of personal family connections as well as a lot of personal involvement in politics. And I'm pretty passionate about some issues. On 960, they have a person that's on the right of the political spectrum at the morning. And so they wanted me, as someone that was more in the center of the political spectrum, to come on in the evening. And so you can get really good interviews and also a lot of good commentary. I talk about business investing. As Jan was kind enough to say, I've got an MBA from Harvard. I've got 30 years corporate experience. Most recently, I was the chief financial officer for the Ottawa Senators hockey team and COO for 3 different businesses, medical device, a pharmaceutical company, and real estate development company, all owned by the owner of the Ottawa Senators. I'm currently the chief operating officer for a real estate development company that's across North America and in Israel. So I know a little bit about business, economics, and finance. Jan, you're right. I still haven't finished that DBA. I'm trying, but I haven't finished it. But I'm working on my doctorate in business, and I'm a visiting professor at DeGroote, where I teach a course on corporate finance. Technology and life sciences, we do spend a fair amount of time on, for obvious reasons, because it's so relevant with COVID-19. And I have been the chief financial officer for both a technology company as well as a life sciences company. Healthcare and COVID-19, I spend a fair amount of time on real estate and planning because, as I mentioned, I have some real estate development expertise. We spend a lot of time on transit, infrastructure, city planning, et cetera, because I'm chair of a civic advocacy organization called Transit Alliance, and arts and culture, based on my experience, both as president of the Mississauga Arts Council, but as some of you may know, my first job after I graduated from Harvard was working for the Walt Disney Company, and I was doing all the financial business strategy work for obviously an entertainment company. So it's something that I'm quite passionate about. But I'm also quite passionate about local media. And I think there's some trends that we're all aware of, but are helpful to really think through that have been happening in media. And so therefore, being in media today, representing a view from Mississauga is something that's really quite interesting to me. So let's talk about some of these trends. People are going to social media for news today. Non-traditional media platforms are taking off. And for people of our age group, Facebook is the #1 place where people are going for news media today. Kids are on TikTok, YouTube, Snapchat, something called Discord. And if you don't know about Discord, it's the #1 place where teenagers are getting information today. And it's something you talk about while you're gaming at the same time. And they're well informed, but they're non-linear. It's not the old, copper wires or cable TVs. It's being where they are. It's telephones. It's smart devices, et cetera, that they're on. If you're watching traditional TV news, more than likely you're over 65. The traditional news is like the old golf clubs that the people that are spending $50,000 a year or more for golf initiations are the people that are watching traditional TV news. The young people don't watch it. Twitter, as an example, is only 11% of the Canadian population. Twitter is for people that are similarly not 65 and over, but 55 and over. Facebook covers 90% of the population, and the people that are dropping Facebook are teenagers and people that are under the age of 30. The other thing that's happened is that we're living in echo chambers. We are tending to only listen to people that agree with us or we agree with. We are no longer listening to the objective person. We're listening to people that have our similar point of view that reinforce the point of view that we're having, which has led to polarization of society. And we know that best from what's happened in the United States, where if you're a Democrat, you listen to CNN or MSNBC, and if you're a Republican, you listen to Fox News. And the crossover listening is almost negligible. News consumption, however, is way up, higher than it's ever been, because people are desperate for information about COVID-19, about vaccines, about the infection rate, about mortality. So at the same time as we're fracturing where we're looking and we're not loyal to any kind of news media, news consumption is up. But the digital consumption that is up is what's referred to as snackers. They come in, and the average length of time that people spend is less than 10 minutes. It's somewhere between 5 and 7 minutes. So they'll come in and they'll listen to the headlines, and then they'll listen to a commentary, but then they won't stay on, and they won't get in-depth news. Society overall has become dependent, at least I think it was in the past, dependent on being exposed to different people and different people's points of views and people's lived experiences. And when we don't open up and listen to and learn from other people, and we only want to hear our own views echoed back to us, will we have the kind of society that we want to have. And I guess the last point, which is even more relevant to us in Mississauga, is that we're becoming even more dominated by fewer newspapers and fewer network TV shows and cable TV channels. And so therefore, having something that is Mississauga based and local is even more important. And so therefore, what I wanted to do and what Saga 960 wants to do is have something that is local and hopefully relevant to you. So let me give you a sense of what we're trying to do. Just this past week, I have had shows on Pride and Pride both in Toronto as well as in Mississauga, and some of the issues associated with Pride and being homosexual or LGBT in a ethnic community, and specifically within the Muslim community, and how challenging that is. I had a show with the current president of the Canadian Bar Association, who is the first Indigenous president of the Canadian Bar Association, who was part of a generation in the 1960s called the Scoop generation, where we actually had a policy in the 1960s that I wasn't aware of, where we went into reservations and we scooped kids up and we forced them to be adopted by white Canadian English families. And he had a great life. He forgot who he was and just refound it in his teenagehoods. And during his adulthood, he introduced his birth mother to his adopted mother, and he became the first Indigenous president of the Canadian Bar Association. And he spoke and he cried on my interview with him in regards to the residential school tragedy that was discovered 2 weeks ago in Kamloops, BC. I had probably the top energy expert on my show talking about how Alberta has changed from oil and gas to alternative energy. And I was surprised by that because I thought that Alberta was still very focused on oil and gas. And he talked about how it is now the #1 place in North America for solar energy. And very quickly, different energy companies are becoming very focused on green. Bottom left-hand corner, today's show at 6 o'clock is absolutely fascinating. A guy by the name of Brad Sorensen with Prudential Life Sciences has developed the first made in Canada messenger RNA, which has got better statistics than Pfizer and Moderna, but he can't get any money from the Canadian federal government. And he's convinced it's because the Canadian government has agreed with others such that they won't support made in Canadian vaccines. He's actually going to the Indian government to get it produced. And it's fascinating because he got into it because his son had brain cancer and he started developing messenger RNA for cancer. And he's convinced that with an expenditure and investment of money, we can come up with a vaccine for cancer. In the middle on the bottom, an Oakville psychiatrist who says that empathy is the most important thing we can have in life. And it's a fascinating conversation. He's written a book on empathy. And on the bottom right, a fascinating, beautiful, and just captivating young lady who talks about aging and health and nutrition and what she did to celebrate becoming 50 years old and passing a milestone. And that was just 1 week. I've had a lot of shows on COVID-19. Just running through the top left, I had a show with the top leasing agent talking about offices and what's going to happen in downtown Toronto. In the middle, talked about females and how females have become the people that have been most harmed in the workplace and at home and in education during COVID-19, where labor force participation by females has, for the first time since 1960, gone down. In the middle, Bob McCown and I talked about the impact on sports. On the right, we talked about small businesses. In the middle, the president of Build, we talked about housing and affordable housing. In the middle, we talked about the impact on Indigenous communities. In the middle, we talked about the impact on beauty salons and spas and massage. And on the right, we talked with the president of Movati, how athletic clubs and places like that have been devastated by COVID-19. He gave me a statistic that they had over 1 million people that came to their facilities over the course of 2020 and the early part of 2021, and they had one infection recorded. and yet the provincial government forced their closure. And we talked about politics, and you'll recognize some of these people. And the top, Catherine McKenna, Minister of Infrastructure. In the middle, a candidate, a very controversial candidate for the Tory leadership that talked about some social conservative issues, so much so that the Conservative Party felt uncomfortable with her joining. In the middle, Diane Francis, who is a columnist with the Financial Post. I've had 3 interviews with her, and she's been really provocative and quite interesting. Top right, I spoke with and interviewed each one of the Green Party leadership candidates. On the left, Shelley Carroll, who is the chair of the Police Services Board, a Mississauga native in the middle, who was the principal secretary to the cabinet in Ontario. And that's the top civil servant in Ontario. And he talked to me about the challenge of running government during an emergency. And he ran the government during SARS, and he retired just before COVID-19. And it was really a frank and interesting conversation by a man from Mississauga, from Streetsville, that rose to become the top guy with everyone in the government reporting to him about how difficult it is to deal with this kind of an emergency. The head of the NDP, Carolyn Mulroney, the Minister of Transportation, Patrick Brown, the mayor of Brampton, who talked about the hot spots in Brampton. Josh Cole, who talked to me about, who's a counselor in Toronto and the head of the TTC, who talked about how devastating COVID-19 has been to transit, 80% reduction in transit. And obviously Hazel McCallion, and I had the privilege of speaking to her 3 days before her 100th birthday. And, if you're a fan of Hazel, I got to tell you, it's a wonderful interview. I really enjoyed it. Go on my website and watch that interview. I enjoyed it immensely. We talked about a lot of Mississaugan global issues. Top left, I had the Port Credit BIA on, talking about beautification of Port Credit. In the middle, the poet laureate of Mississauga, talking about poetry. Sam McDaddy talking about the importance of branding. As I mentioned, Hazel McCallion, and talked about the importance of arts. We had some global issues. I had 5 different female lawyers talking about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court justice that retired. I had several different shows on Black Lives Matter last summer with both Mississauga residents as well as global citizens. And then I had a really fun interview for myself with 10 different classmates of mine from Harvard Business School, talking about how different geographies and cities were dealing with COVID-19, which was fun for me. And I think it was a really good review to talk to just regular people about what they thought was going on with COVID-19. And then just health issues and other issues. And just to give you a sampling, the gentleman with the Eiffel Tower is head of alternative energy investing for Total, a big oil and gas company, who wants to become green and says all of their energy is going to be green by 2030. Bottom of the left-hand side, 2 professors from Lethbridge that came up with a solution for COVID that was cannabis. In the middle, a young lady, a physician from Ontario, that's launched a business consulting people on cancer and dealing with cancer and how you deal with it. On the right-hand side, Hugh Segal, former senator of the Canadian Parliament, who talked about COVID-19 teaching us that a guaranteed annual income was the way to go, which some people think is a sort of a left-wing attitude. He's, as you may know, the #1 principal secretary to Brian Mulroney and Bill Davis in the past, a conservative senator, leader within the Conservative Party, and he's convinced that a guaranteed annual income, which the CERB really was, is the way to go. The head of the TTC talking about transit and how they're going to go forward. And then in the bottom right, a lady that calls herself the hot and holy lady, who talked about how the Bible tells us that we've got to have better relations in our marriages, and that the Bible tells us so. And that was kind of interesting. Married to a Baptist preacher. And let me tell you, that was a provocative, interesting show. Just last week, I had Ken Greenberg talking about transit and planning and how downtowns are going to come back. I had Ava talking about artificial intelligence. And I had the opportunity to talk about my birthday and a milestone and how things are changing. I've got over 600 YouTube videos up of all of my interviews on my Brian Crombie channel. So it's been fascinating for me. I also once a week do a show on internet TV called Canada One TV. And just to give you a sampling, I've had psychologists, I've had in the middle a local MPP. I've had a Buddhist monk who calls himself the urban Buddhist monk, and he's just incredible from a spiritual standpoint. He's out to change the world and bring mindfulness and kindfulness. I've had Louis from Cabin down in Port Credit talking about how terrible COVID-19 has been to local retail, Port Credit streets, main streets, etc. And probably one of the most inspirational people I've ever met. And if you haven't invited her to speak to you, you've got to do it. In the middle and the bottom, a young lady that was born with no arms and no legs, and has traveled the world, has won Paralympic gold medals, has sailed, has climbed the Himalayas. Just a fascinating show. And I get to meet these people and interview them for a month. And I've done arts and culture because, as I mentioned, I've got a real interest in this. On the top left, a guy that played bass guitar for Blondie, Platinum Blonde, etc., for a whole bunch of rock and roll bands. He was really into rock and roll, sex, and drugs, became an addict, destroyed his life because of drugs, went into rehab. And it's a story about rock and roll, and it's a story about how he got out of addiction. And it's one of the most inspirational stories from someone that's gone through rehab that I've heard. And if you have anyone that's going through addiction problems, it's a great interview. Susanna Ho, who is a Mississauga native, went to Juilliard on a violin scholarship, now travels the world, classical violin, just an amazing performer. She won top award Marty a couple of years ago, and I was proud to give that to her. And she now travels and performs as a soloist around the world and comes back to Mississauga with her family to practice. A Mississauga resident that is showing with some of the best fashions in New York Fashion Week. And then I've had this real opportunity to do 4 shows with my mom, Flora Crombie, who's a docent at the National Gallery of Art, talking about art and art appreciation. And we've done a show on art for Mother's Day, art for Easter, and art for Canada Day. And I get more people emailing me back saying, bring back your mom to talk about art appreciation than almost anything else. It's really quite a pleasure for me. So that's my pitch for you. It's been a real opportunity. As I mentioned, I in the past, some people criticized me that I wasn't the type of person that could have a 1 or 2 minute quick conversation with people. I wanted to have a 15-minute, half an hour conversation with people and really get to know them. And I probably had a dream when I was growing up that I wanted to be Larry King and Larry King Live. This, albeit in a small way with a local Mississauga radio station, has given me the opportunity to talk to people 45 minutes a time. I'm on 6 times a week. I pre-record on Monday and Tuesday evenings after regular business hours. I really get to know people. And as I mentioned, I'm up to 600 shows now. And it's been a incredible pleasure for me. And all of my shows are available on briancrombie.com, my website, both podcasts, if you're interested, as well as videocasts. On YouTube, the Brian Crombie Show. You can follow me on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and I give daily updates as to what the show is that night. You can listen to me live on the 960 AM, or you can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca, or you can just catch me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, or something after the fact if something captures your fancy. And thank you very much for the opportunity to tell you a little bit about the Brian Crombie Radio Hour and how it's kept me sane during COVID-19.
Super. Brian, thank you very much for your presentation. You actually answered one of my questions. I was going to ask you, when do you get the time to your show? And if it was pre-recorded, and in most of the cases, it is pre-recorded.
They're all pre-recorded. Some are live, and I fit them in. And I've done, just by the way, I've done a show with Brampton Rotary and some work that they were doing on giving out a PP&E. I've done a show with the Port Credit BIA. So if you ever have an issue that you want to publicize, and with the Brampton Rotary, by an example, we did a Zoom meeting. I think there were 6 of them participated, and they all had an opportunity to speak and talk a little bit about what they were all about. So it's a great opportunity to number one, showcase local initiatives, and number 2, promote them.
Fantastic. Everybody, you're muted or right now. If you want to take yourself off, unmute. And if you have any questions for Brian, put up your hand.
I have a question for Brian. Given all of your people you speak to, what do you think are the 3 biggest issues in the city of Mississauga right now that need to be addressed?
Well, there's no question vaccines is I think the biggest issue, and we need to get the hot spots dealt with. And maybe I'd broaden that from Mississauga to Peel because some of the hot spots are in Brampton. But to reopen and reopen safely, we need to get the vaccine participation rate up. We need to get herd immunity. And that's probably, as people talked about, 70-80% of the population. And probably that's with both vaccines. And so we've got to get the double doses. And, you know, as most people think, that's going to probably be something that we hopefully achieve by August or September, such that we'll be opening up hopefully thereafter. But there's a lot of issues associated with that. For an example, if vaccine hesitancy grows, what do? As you've seen in the United States, there's been lots of issues in regards to, do you give incentives to do that? Manitoba has launched some incentive. From a positive incentive standpoint, the negative incentive would be, and Manitoba similarly has just done this, do we have vaccine passports? And I'm actually going to do a show on Thursday on vaccine passports, where a expert in public health says, and it hasn't been announced politically yet, but he said, look, there's just no question that vaccine passports are the right way to go. And if a public health person or a physician is making the decision, it's unquestionably the right way to go. And the way he described it was interesting. He said, walking around with the infection is like walking around with a weapon. But with this infection, if you're not getting vaccinated, it's like walking around with a gun or with a weapon, and it's loaded, ready to go. And would we allow that in any other part of life? Now, whether you agree with, COVID-19 being real, or whether you agree with vaccines or not, here's an expert in public health that is describing it as carrying around a weapon and it's loaded. And he said, public health rules demand that we therefore have a vaccine. And he predicted that we will require a vaccination certificate or passport to get into a sporting event, to a large assembly, and he said even to schools and churches. Now, I don't know if I agree with him or not, but it's kind of interesting and provocative. And he says politically it's going to be difficult, but it's unquestionably the right way to go. And that's the final way to ensure that people get the vaccine. So I think that's number one. Number two, I would say, is our main streets have been devastated. And you go up and down, main streets in Streetsville or Port Credit, you've probably seen it. So many stores that are suffering. I did a whole week where I interviewed different people in Port Credit, different retailers. And I had one restaurateur that I won't mention, but you probably have been to his restaurant. He said that he was losing $10,000 a week. And you add that up for the year or almost a year that he's closed. He says, Brian, I've got a debt now that's a millstone around my neck that I'll never get out of. And this was my dream to open up this restaurant. It was something I've had. And now I've got, almost $500,000 of extra debt that I wasn't counting on. Now, it's interesting. What he said is last summer when he had the spaces on the street given to him, he was making $50,000 a week. So you go through the math, giving him free rent of parking spaces and a patio that gets well used, he can make some of his money back, but the break even was 4 years. And the local government's talking about giving it to him this year. So, I think we got to help our main streets. We got to help our main streets with rent, with government funding, with support, and potentially things like guaranteeing that they're going to have extra patio space, not for a year, but for several years. And then I think the third issue is transit. And we've been talking about all day two-way go for a long period of time. If you had every 10, maybe some people are talking about 7-minute, but even if it's 15-minute service on all 3 lines that come through from Peel, will solve our problems. And 2 statistics that I've talked to you about before is in the next 10 years, a population the size of Montreal is moving to the Greater Toronto Area. In the next 30 years, 3 to 4 million people are moving to the Greater Toronto Area. Where are we going to put them? And the only solution, number 1, is higher density along transit nodes. And number 2, we're going to have to build out, Milton, Georgetown, Caledon, as you well know. And that's going to take more transit and probably more highways. And right now, whether it's NIMBYism or inertia or whatever, we're not moving fast enough. And you know what, from housing yourself, we're going to price ourselves out of the market such that anyone that is a service worker or an entry-level worker or your sons and daughters and my sons and daughters won't be able to live in, for sure, Toronto, if not, frankly, the inner suburbs like Mississauga, unless we dramatically increase our density. And people get worried about that, and I think it's going to impact their neighborhoods. If you go to Yonge Street, the increased density is at Yonge and Eglinton, Yonge and St. Clair, Yonge and Shepherd. But a block away, you got single family homes. So we should have massive density at Port Credit, at Cooksville, at Streetsville, at along the Milton line if it becomes all day 2-way, at Dixie and at Huron, Ontario. But don't worry, 2 blocks away or a block away, you're not going to have that density. But that is, I think, affordable housing and the connectivity to transit and not just affordable housing for the poor, but affordable housing for everybody is, I think, going to be the number 1 issue in the next decade.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have a question for Brian? I guess not.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure presenting to you. And if you get a chance, please check out one of my shows.
We will do that. Thank you very much, Brian.
Thank you,
Brian. Great to see you.
Brian.
Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Oh, Brian, if you can return host power to me.
Okay, I'm trying to figure out how to do that.
So David,
Good. Yes, Andy.